She boarded Flight 203 with nothing but a carry-on and quiet confidence. Her name was Dr. Nadine Langford, CEO, mother, and one of the most powerful black women in the tech and education sectors. Seat 1A had her name on it, not by chance, but by merit. But somewhere between takeoff and turbulence, a stranger challenged her right to be there, not because she had done anything wrong, but because of what she looked like. What happened next? It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, and yet it shook an entire industry. Why would a man risk public shame just to question a stranger's seat? Why did a calm, composed woman become the spark of a nationwide reckoning? And what secret power was Dr. Langford quietly holding all along? This isn't just a story about race, power, and presence at 35,000 feet. It's a mirror, one that forces us to ask, who do we assume deserves to belong and why? If you're ready to hear the full story, one filled with quiet fire, poetic justice, and a moment that changed everything, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because what happens next will stay with you. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the tinted windows of Gate B6 at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. A soft golden hue washed over the waiting area, illuminating tired business travelers, restless toddlers, and couples whispering over coffee cups. Boarding for Solstice Airlines Flight 203 to San Francisco had just begun, and the overhead chime rang out with polite authority. Group 1 was called first, and Dr. Nadine Langford rose from her seat without fanfare. She was dressed in a tailored slate gray pantsuit, the kind that spoke of understated wealth. Her shoes were polished but practical. Her tightly coiled curls were pulled back into a soft bun at the nape of her neck. No flashy jewelry, just a gold watch and a delicate sapphire ring that caught the light whenever she reached for her leather portfolio. She walked with quiet confidence down the jet bridge, nodding at the flight attendants as she stepped onto the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. First class was nearly empty. She made her way to seat 1A, placed her folio in the seat pocket, and settled in by the window. No checking the menu, no selfies, no nervous glancing around. Just calm. The aircraft was cool and still, like the inside of a chapel before the service began. Nadine pulled out her tablet and stylus and resumed reviewing a proposal from a clean water startup in rural Colorado. Her firm, Langford Innovations, funded sustainability projects across North America. Most people didn't know that. They just assumed she was another business traveler. 3 rows behind her, Gregory Talbot dropped into seat 2A with a grunt. He was the kind of man who made his presence known even before he spoke. Broad frame, loud cologne, an expensive watch that seemed to blink for attention under the cabin lights. His wife, Elaine, followed with a faux leather tote, slipping into 2B with a practiced sigh. They traveled often. First class was their domain. At least, that's how Greg saw it. He scanned the cabin with pale blue eyes that missed nothing and appreciated little. They lingered on Nadine's back. He leaned toward Elaine and whispered, "Not quite low enough." "Interesting how standards have changed," he said, his voice coated in condescension. Elaine made a face like she had tasted something bitter. She hummed in agreement, pulling out her phone. Maybe they're doing some kind of promotional upgrade thing. Nadine didn't turn around, but she heard every word. Years of working in boardrooms and negotiating billion-dollar deals had sharpened her senses. She had learned the fine art of listening without reacting. Still, a part of her bristled. She tapped her stylus lightly against the screen. Breathe. Stay in the moment. A flight attendant with auburn curls and a tired smile approached her row. "Good morning. Doctor, Ma'am, would you like a mimosa or sparkling water before takeoff?" Nadine looked up, smiled warmly. "Sparkling water, please. No lemon." "Yes, of course," the attendant replied, retreating with a quick glance back. Her expression caught somewhere between familiarity and confusion. Nadine didn't mind. Recognition happened often, not always immediately. Sometimes people placed her from a Forbes feature, sometimes from a conference panel, sometimes not at all. That didn't bother her either. Back in 2A, Gregory fidgeted. He was watching. The poise irritated him. Her calmness read, in his mind, as arrogance. Probably her first time up here. He muttered, unwrapping a stick of peppermint gum. Champagne at 9 in the morning. What's next? Selfies in the aisle. Elaine tittered without humor and started checking her phone's camera, discreetly angling it toward the front of the cabin. Nadine glanced at her reflection in the window. The glow of the tablet screen lit her face from below. For a second, she remembered her mother on the steps of their apartment, pressing a travel mug into her hands when she was 23 and leaving for her first board meeting. "They'll look right through you, baby," her mother had warned. "So make sure when they finally see you, it's too late to doubt you." She had carried that memory like armor ever since. Passengers continued to board, first class filled. The familiar rhythm of flight preparation began seatbelt checks, carry-on adjustments, a few nervous laughs. The cabin buzzed gently with pre-departure chatter. Flight 203 was on time, scheduled to land at SFO by noon. A quick, efficient route for the city's movers and shakers. Nadine reached for her water, thanked the attendant again, and resumed marking up the proposal. Her stylus danced over the screen in smooth, confident lines. Her handwriting, even in digital ink, was elegant and fluid. She underlined a line about projected water accessibility in tribal communities and made a note to flag it for legal review. Then she paused. There it was again. The feeling. Gregory's eyes on her back. She didn't have to turn around to know. There was a weight to certain stares. Not curiosity. Not admiration. Something else. That subtle, needling challenge wrapped in entitlement. Nadine took a deep breath and let it go. But across the aisle, a younger man in 1C had also noticed. He shifted uncomfortably, looked back at Gregory, then at Nadine, unsure whether to speak. The woman in 1D caught the moment, too, and lowered her book slightly. Listening, small signs, shared awareness, the kind of silent witnesses that fill the spaces where dignity is tested. As the aircraft door closed and the chime rang out again, Nadine adjusted her seat, looked out the window, and let the hum of the engine replace the noise of people who didn't know her but thought they did. This was supposed to be a routine flight, but something told her it wouldn't be. She didn't know yet how right she was. The hum of the engines grew louder as the Boeing 787 Dreamliner taxied slowly away from the gate. Sunlight streaked through the angled windows of the first-class cabin, casting lines of gold across leather seats, designer briefcases, and tired foreheads. The energy was still subdued, that quiet anticipation that comes before a journey properly begins. Nadine Langford leaned back in seat 1A and let her eyes close just for a moment. She had been up since 4:30 that morning, barely enough time to make tea and go over her board notes before the car arrived. Still, she never slept on planes. There was something about being in the air between two places that always made her more alert than tired. From 3 rows behind, Gregory Talbot was still watching her. Not overtly, just in the way some men look when they believe their gaze alone is enough to unsettle you. His fingers tapped against the tray table. Tap, tap, pause, tap. It was almost rhythmic, like he was counting the seconds before something justified his unease. "Did you see the way she waved the flight attendant off?" he muttered to Elaine. His wife nodded. "And that tablet, probably playing some game. These people think they have to look important." Greg smiled smugly. "She's overcompensating." But Nadine wasn't playing any games. She had just finished revising a grant approval sheet for the Langford Foundation's Q3 programs. Her company, Solace Tech, had recently surpassed $5 billion in market value, but none of that was visible from where Greg was sitting. All he saw was what he wanted to see: a black woman sitting alone in seat 1A. That, to him, was a disruption of the natural order. A flight attendant approached with a tray of pre-departure beverages. Nadine declined again, asking only for a cup of hot mint tea when they reached altitude. Her voice was polite, gentle, but it carried the quiet authority of someone who expected to be taken seriously. Behind her, Elaine rolled her eyes and raised her phone slightly higher. The red record light blinked against her manicure. The screen angled just enough to capture Nadine's profile. "Just in case," she whispered. "Smart," Greg replied. The flight attendant moved to 1C and asked a younger man if he'd like champagne. He glanced at Nadine, then back at the attendant, and declined. It was subtle, but there was a shift in the air. People were beginning to feel the tension, though no one had said anything inappropriate yet. It was all in the implication, in the tone, in the side glances and unfinished sentences. Nadine felt it too. She had known these moments since she was 9, standing beside her mother in the grocery checkout line when a woman behind them said, "You people always hold everything up," or 16, when a hotel clerk refused to believe she could afford a double room, or 28, the day she walked into a VC pitch meeting and one of the partners asked if she was with catering. She had become a master at absorbing without reacting, but every instance left a mark. As the aircraft lifted off the tarmac, Nadine stared straight ahead. Her fingers rested on the armrest, calm and steady. Her stylus had been put away. The proposal could wait. She thought of her daughter, Zuri, a second-year architecture student at Brown. She had inherited her mother's sharp eyes and stubborn grace. Just the week before, Zuri had called her in tears after a professor questioned whether she had actually designed a scale model on her own. "They just don't expect me to be good," Zuri had said through sniffles. Nadine had paused, her voice soft but anchored. "You don't owe them your exhaustion, baby. You owe them your excellence." She wondered now if that advice still rang true. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight leveled out. A few passengers unbuckled and leaned back. Others tapped on screens or read through printed itineraries. The man in 1C stole a glance at Nadine again, then quietly put his phone on airplane mode. There was no mistaking it anymore. The atmosphere had shifted, not just because of the subtle hostility from Greg Talbot, but because of the way people were beginning to witness it. No one had spoken up, but something was forming just beneath the surface. In 2A, Greg shifted in his seat again and whispered to Elaine, "I bet she's flying on points, or a corporate sponsorship," Elaine added. Greg nodded. "She doesn't have the look. You know what I mean." That was the line, not spoken aloud, but whispered clearly enough for nearby rows to hear. The look, the presumed image of who belongs where, of who gets to sit in 1A without question. It wasn't about income, not really. It wasn't even about behavior. It was about access, and who was expected to have it. Nadine sat perfectly still. She had heard it. She always heard it. Her silence wasn't submission. It was calculation. She looked out the window at the streaks of clouds below, the kind that looked painted in layers of white and pearl. It was peaceful out there. No judgment, no roles, no assumptions, just sky. The flight attendant returned with her tea. "Here you are, ma'am, steeped just a bit longer, the way you asked." "Thank you," Nadine replied with genuine warmth. She lifted the cup slowly. It was her small act of resistance, her own ritual. Every time she flew, she did the same thing. Mint tea, window seat, one small corner of the world where she was centered, regardless of what others thought. "Back in 2A, Greg scowled. "She's just trying to look composed," he mumbled. "Recording's still going," Elaine said quietly. Nadine turned her head slightly, just enough to see their reflection in the window. They were leaning toward each other, feeding off the same smugness. They weren't curious. They weren't confused. They were certain, and that certainty had always been the most dangerous kind. Her mother had once told her, "Certainty is what makes people deny what's right in front of them." Nadine took another sip of tea. The warmth steadied her, but she could feel it building. That slow, simmering sense that something was about to shift. She wasn't afraid. She was just tired. And that, too, was dangerous. When a woman like Nadine Langford gets tired not of flying, but of being questioned, change is coming. She reached for her tablet again, but this time, not for work. She opened her Notes app, created a new folder, labeled it Flight 203, Incident Log. Then, without turning, without blinking, she typed the first entry. Observed passenger in 2A repeatedly filming without consent. Hostile tone. Class-coded comments. Logged. No response necessary yet. She saved the note, closed the app, and returned to her reading. Above her, the seatbelt sign blinked off. But somewhere in the space between civility and confrontation, a different kind of turbulence was forming, and it would have nothing to do with altitude. The tea had cooled by the time Nadine reached the last paragraph of the policy summary. She had barely taken a sip since saving her incident log note. The tension in the cabin had become a quiet undercurrent, something most passengers could feel, even if they didn't yet know what it was. In seat 2A, Gregory Talbot was no longer just irritated. He was uncomfortable. And for a man like Greg, discomfort felt like a threat. He tapped his finger again. That rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. "What's the matter?" Elaine whispered beside him, tucking her phone into her purse. Greg shook his head. "I'm just saying. Something's off." Elaine didn't respond. She was used to Greg's moods, his performative frustrations with the world, but even she sensed he was about to escalate. She leaned back, closed her eyes. If he was going to embarrass himself, she wouldn't stop him. She never did. "In 1A?" Nadine closed her tablet gently and slid it into the leather side pocket. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately. Her breathing remained even. She had learned long ago that staying composed was sometimes her most powerful shield. She didn't know it yet, but she had just taken her last peaceful breath of the flight. Greg unbuckled his seatbelt and stood abruptly. The motion startled the flight attendant near the front galley, who paused mid-service. Other passengers lifted their heads slightly, sensing movement where there should have been stillness. Greg stepped into the aisle, one hand gripping the headrest in front of him for balance. "Excuse me," he said, loud enough to command attention, but still dressed in false politeness. Nadine turned her head slightly, calm, alert. Greg smiled the way some men smile when they want to pretend they're asking instead of accusing. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." There it was. The silence that followed was almost cinematic. Forks froze over breakfast trays. Screens paused mid-movie. Conversations fell off mid-sentence. Nadine blinked once, slowly, then tilted her head up to meet his gaze. "I'm sorry," she asked, not because she didn't hear him, but because she wanted him to hear himself. "I said," Greg repeated, "I'd like to verify your boarding pass, just to be sure there hasn't been some mistake." "And who exactly are you?" Nadine asked, her voice perfectly level. Greg glanced around, almost surprised that no one else had jumped in to support him. He cleared his throat. "I'm a concerned passenger. I've been flying Solstice Airlines for 30 years. First class has certain standards and, well, I've never seen this kind of irregularity." The word hung in the air like a slur in disguise. Nadine didn't flinch, but something in her jaw tightened. Behind her, the man in 1C slowly removed his headphones. Across the aisle, the woman in 1D turned in her seat. Others were watching now, carefully, some with concern, some with quiet interest, all of them bearing witness. Elaine looked up from her seat and pressed record again. Nadine reached into her purse, retrieved her boarding pass, and handed it to Greg with the poise of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to lose if she reacted the wrong way. "Here you go," she said simply. Greg examined it like it was counterfeit currency, flipped it, squinted, cross-checked the seat number with the plaque overhead. "You understand," he said, voice dipping into justification. "Sometimes people sneak into these seats. Upgrades they didn't earn, documents that aren't real, credit cards that don't belong to them." Nadine said nothing. Her silence echoed louder than any protest. Her eyes didn't waver. She had endured dozens of boardrooms, each with its own Gregory Talbot. Men who talked over her, men who laughed before she finished a sentence, men who clapped when she exited the room, believing they had just taught her something. But this was different, because this wasn't private. This was public. This was a performance, and she was done playing along. Behind Greg, the younger man in 1C finally spoke. "Sir, maybe you should sit down." Greg turned sharply. "This doesn't concern you." "I think it does," the young man replied quietly. "We're all sitting here watching this, and I think we know what this looks like." Greg's cheeks flushed. Security's gotten soft. These days, you can't even ask questions without being called names. The flight attendant returned, stepping between them with practiced diplomacy. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat. If there's a concern, you may speak with the captain." "Oh, I will," Greg snapped. "Believe me, I will. Someone has to maintain standards around here." Nadine took back her boarding pass, folded it once, and returned it to her purse. Her hand brushed the sapphire ring. It steadied her. She turned to the attendant. "Thank you." The attendant nodded, hesitant, unsure how to proceed. Greg returned to his seat with all the subtlety of a protest march. He pressed the call button twice. Behind him, Elaine grinned like someone who had just ordered popcorn for the second act. In the cockpit, Captain Luis Navarro was reviewing wind speeds and turbulence forecasts when the notification came through. "Cabin incident. Row 1A and 2A. First class. Passenger dispute." He sighed, unbuckled, and walked into a story that would follow him for years. When he reached the front cabin, the atmosphere was tight, controlled, but electric. Greg stood as soon as he saw him. "Captain, thank you. I have serious concerns about this passenger." He gestured toward Nadine. Captain Navarro turned slowly. His eyes met hers, and something clicked. Recognition, a name he had seen before, a scholarship application, a donation receipt, a sealed envelope marked from Langford Foundation, the year his daughter got accepted into medical school and couldn't afford tuition. He blinked once. The woman in seat 1A was Dr. Nadine Langford, and he had just been summoned to question her right to sit in the very cabin her company likely funded. "Sir," the captain said slowly, "these are very serious accusations." "Are you saying this passenger is a threat to flight security?" Greg hesitated. "I'm saying she doesn't look like she belongs in this cabin. I've been flying for 3 decades. I know what the usual passengers look like." There it was, the mask slipping. The real reason. A few passengers gasped. One woman audibly whispered, "Wow." Captain Navarro's face went blank. He turned to Nadine, his voice now laced with quiet respect. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for the disturbance. If there's anything I can do—" Nadine met his eyes and spoke evenly. "I think this flight just taught us all something. That will be enough for now. Captain—" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The cabin was already holding its breath. Captain Navarro nodded, backed away, and returned to the cockpit, the weight of shame pressing against his spine. Behind him, Greg sat down with a huff. He didn't know it yet, but the moment had already begun, unraveling everything he thought he knew. The seatbelt light blinked back on, just as Flight 203 hit a patch of mild turbulence. The slight jolt gave the momentary illusion that something outside the plane had shifted. But the real disruption was happening in the narrow aisle between seats 1A and 2A. Dr. Nadine Langford sat silently, her back straight, eyes focused on the horizon just beyond the window. It was always this quiet at cruising altitude, that strange suspended stillness that made the sky feel like its own kind of courtroom. She could still feel the weight of Gregory Talbot's words echoing in her mind. "She doesn't look like she belongs here." That one sentence, said out loud and in public, had turned the cabin into a stage. Nadine had been on many stages in her life, industry panels, graduation commencements, keynotes at the UN Sustainable Futures Forum, but she had never asked for this one. It had been forced on her. Across the aisle in 1C, the young man who had spoken up earlier leaned forward, trying to catch her eye. She didn't acknowledge him, but she appreciated the gesture. He had spoken when it counted. That, in itself, was rare. Behind her, Elaine Talbot scrolled through her phone with unsettling calm. The video was already being trimmed, cropped, captioned. "Out-of-place woman refuses to prove she belongs in first class." The draft caption read. She showed it to her husband. Greg grinned and nodded. "Send it." It was already uploading by the time Captain Navarro returned to the cockpit. But the damage they thought they were doing wasn't the damage they would end up with. Nadine breathed in through her nose, slow and deep, her mind moving like water over stones. She was trying to decide what this moment required of her: fight or flow. Most of her life had been a balance between the two. A nearby attendant approached carefully. Her name tag read Olivia. She looked young, maybe late 20s, eyes flickering with nervous apology. "Ma'am," Olivia said softly, "would you like anything else?" "Tia snack," Nadine offered a gentle smile, but shook her head. "No, thank you. I'm fine." The attendant hesitated, then added in a lower tone, "I'm so sorry about what happened." Nadine gave a small nod, not because she accepted the apology, but because she understood Olivia was only trying to make it right in the limited way she could. As the attendant walked away, Nadine stared again at the clouds. Not white today, but layered in smoky gray and soft gold. There was something calming in the repetition of their shape, Her phone buzzed quietly. A message from Jared Fields, her assistant. Just landed your 11 a.m. call for after you land. Need me to flag Talbot's name? Nadine stared at the message for a moment, then slowly typed back. Yes. Seat 2A. Gregory Talbot. Look into existing contracts. Vendor status. Cross-check with our legal department. Jared responded instantly. On it. She tucked the phone into her armrest pocket and folded her hands in her lap. She didn't need to look again. She had committed his name to memory the second he stood up in the aisle. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about what he represented. A few rows back, Greg continued explaining his actions to anyone who would listen. People forget, he said, gesturing with his hands like a lawyer making a closing argument. First class is earned. It's not just handed out because someone wants to play dress-up. A woman in 3D quietly picked up her phone and began recording. Another man across the aisle muttered something under his breath and turned away, unwilling to engage, but no longer neutral. Greg didn't notice. He was too busy basking in the imaginary spotlight he thought he had seized. Elaine smiled, finally satisfied with the uploaded video. It had just reached 408 views in the first 3 minutes. She refreshed the screen. 512. Comments were already appearing. She should be grateful she got a seat at all. She's probably a diversity hire. Entitlement at its finest. Nadine would not see those comments for several more hours, but she had read versions of them her entire life. She remembered being 14, presenting her science fair project on water filtration in Flint. The judge had complimented her white lab partner, not her. She remembered being 21 applying for internships in DEAC, being asked if she was on scholarship or affirmative action. She remembered being 35 closing her first acquisition deal and being called unusually articulate. Each moment chipped away at something, and she had spent her career learning how to build it back stronger, quieter, sharper. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was assessing, preparing. Olivia returned with a hot towel and placed it beside her. Captain says we'll be over New Mexico soon. Should be smooth sailing from here. Nadine gave her another nod, grateful for the attempt at normalcy. From behind, Greg's voice rose again. Look, I don't care who she is. If she can't handle someone asking questions, maybe she doesn't belong up here after all. Nadine turned slightly toward the aisle, catching his reflection in the polished surface of the overhead bin. Still defiant, still convinced, still dangerous in the way certainty always is. She picked up her tablet again, unlocked it, and opened her private notes folder titled Langford Internal. She created a new entry vendor audit, Talbot & Co. potential breach of Solstice Partnership values. Investigate discriminatory conduct. Legal priority. Flag all upcoming contracts. She paused, then added, begin procurement review upon landing. It was that simple. Her fingers moved like they always did, steady and without rush. Behind her, Greg leaned back in his seat. Smug. I showed her. Elaine checked the view count again. Over 2,000. Neither of them noticed the man in 1C recording, or the quiet look exchanged between him and the woman in 1D, or the growing discomfort among those who had remained silent too long. Something was shifting, and it was no longer just Nadine who felt it. As Flight 203 crossed into Western airspace, the light outside changed again, from bright gold to soft blue. The kind of light that tells you something is coming, not a storm, a reckoning. Captain Luis Navarro had seen all kinds of incidents in his 15 years flying commercial aircraft. Drunken passengers, medical emergencies, even a surprise mid-air proposal that led to tears. cheers, and one painfully awkward breakup 2 hours later. But nothing in his training had fully prepared him for what he had just witnessed in first class. He stood in the cockpit doorway, staring down the length of the aisle toward seat 1A. The door to the cabin was open, the curtain gently swaying with the pressure change. He hadn't yet processed what the passenger in 2A had said, but he felt the heat of it still sitting on his skin. "She doesn't look like she belongs here." Louis had been raised to treat people with respect. His parents had worked double shifts cleaning offices in downtown Houston, often arriving home long after midnight. His mother used to sleep on the bus just to get an extra 20 minutes of rest. They taught him that dignity was something you extended, not something you required proof of. But now here he was, standing at the edge of an unraveling moment, and the woman being challenged was familiar. He pulled out the passenger manifest again and looked at the name for seat 1A. Langford. Nadine A. He said the name aloud in his mind once, twice, a third time. Then it hit him years ago, during his daughter's junior year of high school. They had almost given up on her dream of medical school. She had the grades, the drive, the community hours, but not the money. A counselor suggested applying to the Langford Foundation's Rising Scholars Program. He remembered the long nights they spent filling out the paperwork, the interviews, the silence as they waited, and then the acceptance letter. He remembered the tears, the envelope that arrived with no return address, only a gold-embossed LF at the top, a full scholarship, books, travel stipend, a personal letter from the board. He remembered wondering who Nadine Langford was. And now he was looking at her. She wasn't just another passenger. She was the woman who had made his daughter's future possible. Louis stepped back, breathing through the wave of recognition. He adjusted his collar, smoothed his uniform, and walked slowly into the first-class cabin. Gregory Talbot was already standing again, clearly expecting backup. "Captain," he said, with a relieved smile, "thank you for coming. I believe there's a serious issue with this passenger. Her credentials should be verified." Louis glanced at Nadine. She was still seated, still composed, her hands folded in her lap. Their eyes met for a second. Not long, just long enough for him to see that she knew exactly who she was and exactly what was happening. He turned back to Greg. "Sir, may I ask what specific concern you have?" Greg straightened, puffed his chest. "She's sitting in 1A. I asked to see her boarding pass. She presented it. But something doesn't feel right. I believe it could be fake. Maybe stolen. Look, I've seen these scams before. People buy cheap coach seats and sneak up front. I'm just trying to protect the integrity of this cabin." Louis paused. The word integrity echoed too loudly. "Do you have any evidence of fraudulent behavior?" he asked. "No, but you can't just go by a piece of paper," Greg insisted. "You have to look at the whole picture. Who they are, how they act, what they wear. It's common sense." Louis could feel a dozen pairs of eyes on him. First-class passengers were now fully tuned in. He saw phones angled discreetly, thumbs ready to hit record if they hadn't already. He turned slowly toward Nadine. She nodded once, as if to say, "I'm fine. Let him finish." Louis breathed in, then out. "Sir," he said carefully, "this passenger is seated correctly. Her documentation is valid. And as the captain of this aircraft, I can assure you she poses no security threat of any kind." Greg's mouth opened, then closed. Elaine shifted uncomfortably in her seat, lowering her phone. Louis wasn't finished. "In fact," he added, "I personally recognize this passenger. Dr. Langford is a respected business leader and philanthropist. And I can tell you, from first-hand knowledge, that she belongs here more than most." Greg blinked. "What do you mean recognize?" Louis didn't answer that part. It wasn't necessary. Instead, he looked at Nadine again, his voice softening. "Dr. Langford, I want to apologize on behalf of the crew for this disruption." Nadine nodded once. "Thank you, Captain." He turned and walked back toward the cockpit, his jaw set tight. He wasn't sure what else he could say that wouldn't make things worse. His heart pounded as he sat back in his seat. He wanted to call his daughter. He wanted to tell her that the woman whose signature was on her scholarship letter had just been harassed in front of an entire cabin. But more than that, he wanted to do something. And for now, all he could do was fly the plane. Back in 1A, Nadine looked down at her hands. The sapphire ring caught the light again. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the hurt. Not rage, not outrage, just the sting of recognition. Even here, even now. Still, behind her, Greg sat frozen. He had expected backup. Instead, he got consequences. Elaine leaned over. "This is going to look bad if it goes viral." Greg scoffed. "They won't know who she is." Elaine checked her feed. "They will now." On her screen, the original video had been reposted by 3 separate accounts. One of them had tagged Solstice Airlines. Another had added the caption, "Black woman harassed in first class. Passenger demands to see ID. Then captain shuts him down. Wait until you see who she is." Nadine reached for her tablet again, opened her encrypted messaging app. She sent one message to Jared, confirmed Talbot's vendor ID. Freeze all Solstice contracts. Alert legal. Then another schedule emergency board call after landing. Policy audit required. Her fingers moved without hesitation. She didn't need revenge. She needed results. She closed the app and placed the tablet aside. Then she opened a soft leather-bound journal from her purse. She began to write. Not a speech, not a report, a letter to her daughter. Zuri. This morning, I sat in 1A like I always do. I wore the same clothes, followed the same routine. But today, someone saw me and decided I didn't belong. Not because of my actions, because of my appearance. And I thought of you. She paused, let the ink settle, then continued. You will face these moments too. I wish I could protect you from them, but I can't. What I can tell you is this: when they come, you will not be alone. You come from women who have already survived the question, and every time we sit down and do not move, we make room for the next one of us. She closed the journal slowly, exhaled, and looked out at the sky again. It was the same sky as always, but she was different now, and so was this flight. As the aircraft sailed over the desert plains of New Mexico, the tension in the first-class cabin didn't dissolve. It evolved. It thickened. The drama had already passed its flashpoint, but its aftershocks kept rippling through the rows, settling into hushed glances and nervous energy. Nadine Langford remained composed in seat 1A, her journal tucked back into her bag, the last line of her letter to Zuri still echoing in her heart. You come from women who have already survived the question. Now it was time to decide what kind of woman she would be for the rest of this flight. She didn't need to speak, not yet. Her silence was not retreat, it was readiness. Across from her, the young man in 1C gave her a small nod, a quiet recognition that he'd seen what unfolded. He didn't know her name. He didn't need to. Respect did not require familiarity. In 2A, Greg Talbot was fuming. He had not been embarrassed like that in public since he was a sophomore at Yale and lost a debate to a black professor he'd referred to as too emotional to be objective. It had stuck with him then. Now, it stung again. Except this time, the witnesses weren't academic peers. They were travelers, citizens, internet users, and Elaine, who was glued to her phone, refreshing the post every few seconds. Views had crossed 28,000, then 30, then 35. The first comment with significant traction had just appeared. That's Dr. Nadine Langford. She funds STEM programs across the country. The guy demanding her ID should lose every contract he's ever signed. Greg tried to ignore it, but Elaine showed it to him anyway. "This isn't going to die quietly," she whispered. Greg's jaw clenched. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You did something loud," she said. He sat back in his seat, arms crossed, and for the first time felt something heavier than indignation. A shadow of fear. The fear of being seen for who he truly was. Not a loyal customer, not a concerned citizen, but a man caught naked in his entitlement, on camera, mid-air, with no chance to spin it before the world saw it for what it was. A few rows back in 3D, a teenage girl showed the video to her mother. "That's the woman who spoke at our school. Remember the robotics grant?" Her mother blinked. "The one who gave us funding." "Yeah, her. That's her." The mother looked toward the front of the plane and saw Nadine for the first time. Really saw her. A person, not a headline. The ripple continued. Flight attendant Olivia walked slowly down the aisle with the beverage cart. Her palms were sweaty. She hadn't stopped thinking about the look on Dr. Langford's face when she was accused. Not just surprised. It was the kind of look a person wears when something expected still manages to hurt. She reached 1A and bent slightly. "Dr. Langford," she said softly, "I want you to know we've made a formal incident report. The captain asked us to document everything in detail. If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Nadine looked up, her eyes warm but measured. "I appreciate that, Olivia." Olivia smiled gently and continued down the aisle. Nadine reopened her tablet and scrolled through her inbox. New alerts had started trickling in. The board had seen the video. One message from Chairwoman Loris Benton simply read, "Call me when you land. I'm with you." Another message came from Miles Chin, head of Solstice's in-flight operations. "We are initiating a top-down crew training review and public statement. We're not waiting. You shouldn't have to ask." Nadine exhaled softly. She hadn't expected such swift momentum, but perhaps that was the power of timing, of visibility, of a camera pointed at the exact moment truth refused to be ignored. She tapped out a quick message to Jared, drafting a personal statement. "I want it published 30 minutes after landing. No reactive tone. Set the moral tone. Frame it as dignity over division." Jared replied instantly. "Got it. Grace is not silence. That kind of tone." "Exactly," she typed. As she composed herself to begin writing, the cabin announcement system dinged. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet. Estimated arrival into San Francisco is on time. Skies are clear. We'll be descending in just under an hour. Thank you for flying Solstice Airlines." Luis Navarro's voice was steady, but in the cockpit, his heart was still racing. He had already typed up a preliminary internal memo to the Solstice board. It included an apology, a personal reference, and a clear recommendation that the airline initiate mandatory racial bias retraining for premium cabin staff and passengers on frequent flyer status. He even proposed a new initiative, the Passenger Respect Code. He knew it might get buried in bureaucracy, but not if this story kept growing. Not if Dr. Langford spoke, and he hoped she would. in seat 1C. The young man finally leaned over. "Dr. Langford," he said carefully, "I just want to say I'm sorry you had to go through that. I've seen your work. I admire what you've built." She turned, offering a soft smile. "Thank you," she replied. "It's always strange to be recognized. But today, I'm glad someone did." He nodded. "I recorded part of it. If you need it, it's yours." Nadine nodded slowly. "Send it to Solstice Legal and keep a copy." He smiled. "Already done." Greg, overhearing the exchange, grew red in the face. "Everybody's acting like she's some hero. All I did was ask a question." Nadine turned this time, her voice measured. "No, Mr. Talbot, you made an accusation, one based not on facts, but on how I looked. That's not curiosity. That's profiling. And the moment you acted on it, you turned this cabin into a courtroom. You made yourself the judge." Greg scoffed. "You don't get to redefine things just because you're famous." "I'm not redefining anything," she said calmly. "I'm reminding you that belonging doesn't have a look, and neither does decency." There was silence. This time, no one tried to fill it. The flight attendant returned to her station. The mother in row 3 wiped a tear from her eye. The video continued climbing. By the time they reached California airspace, it would pass 200,000 views. But more important than the views were the conversations. Parents texting their kids, colleagues messaging each other about unconscious bias, a teacher somewhere pausing her lesson to ask students what they would have done, and Nadine quietly sitting in 1A, writing not to justify herself, but to elevate the moment, to mark the difference between surviving and changing something. And for the first time that morning, she looked out the window and smiled. Because this flight was no longer about just getting from one place to another. It had become a passage. The hush in first class felt heavier than the altitude, not because people weren't speaking, but because they were thinking, reflecting, some avoiding, others processing. At 35,000 feet, there is nowhere to hide when you witness something that cracks your comfort open. Nadine sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap. She had written and rewritten the first line of her public statement in her mind a dozen times. Each version walked a different line. Grace, anger, resolve. She didn't want to give in to rage, but she refused to dilute the truth. Not this time. Jared's earlier message sat open on her tablet screen. Headline options for release. 1. Dignity interrupted. 2. In the cabin where it happened. 3. Black in 1A, when visibility isn't protection. Nadine tapped 3 and held her finger there for a moment before letting go. The phrase made her chest tighten. Being seen did not mean being safe. Being successful did not mean being immune. Across the aisle. The young man in 1C had put away his tablet and pulled out a paperback book. But he hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. He kept glancing at Nadine, not out of pity, but a kind of quiet awe. She had held the cabin in her silence. She had shifted the air without raising her voice. A woman in 2C, a sharp-looking executive in her 40s, leaned toward him. "Do you know her?" she whispered. He nodded. "That's Nadine Langford." Her eyebrows rose. "The Langford Initiative." He nodded again. "That one." The woman sat back in her seat. And just like that, another person saw the full picture. The ripples kept moving outward. Meanwhile, Greg Talbot sat stone still. Every time he checked his phone, his heart rate surged. The comments were no longer just coming in. They were spreading. The video had landed on a high-traffic Twitter thread called Flying While Black. He read each post like it was a legal summons. So many people think like this and never get caught. This is why representation matters. This is why we record everything." He handed his phone to Elaine, his voice tight. "Tell me this is salvageable." Elaine scrolled, her lips pressed together. "This is beyond PR." "You went after the wrong person." "I didn't go after her. You challenged her place. That's the same thing now." He slumped lower in his seat, hating the truth in her voice. 2 rows back. A college-age woman gently stood up and walked to the front galley. Her name was Caitlin Everett. She had been quiet most of the flight, nestled in 4A, finishing her thesis on systemic bias in corporate leadership. She had written about Nadine Langford just weeks ago. Seeing her here, live, present, unguarded, felt surreal. Olivia, the flight attendant, looked up as Caitlin approached. "I just wanted to ask," Caitlin said softly. "Are you okay? I mean, everything that happened back there." Olivia nodded. Her smile was small but grateful. "I'm all right, just shaken. That's not how any of us want to see our cabin run." Caitlin hesitated. "I know who she is. I've studied her. She's changed how I see myself." Olivia's eyebrows lifted slightly. "She changed how I see my job today," Olivia replied. They shared a moment, a quiet bond between strangers. Then Caitlin returned to her seat, feeling less alone in her admiration. In the cockpit, Captain Navarro had just finished submitting his internal memo. His hands hovered over the controls, but his mind was elsewhere, on his daughter, on the foundation that helped her, on the woman behind that kindness, now seated just 20 feet behind him, being publicly humiliated. He picked up the intercom again, pressed the button, and spoke with unusual weight in his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We'll be starting our descent into San Francisco in approximately 20 minutes. I want to thank you for your attention and, especially today, your respect. This flight has reminded me, and I hope all of us, that character is something you carry with you, not something assigned to your seat." The silence that followed was complete. Nadine looked up. She heard every word, and in that moment, she realized something had changed. Not only had someone recognized her, someone had defended her, named the truth, and that, more than justice, was what so many people longed for. Back in 1A, she opened her statement draft. She began to type, "Today, I took seat 1A just as I've done hundreds of times before. I boarded quietly. I did not speak loudly. I did not break any rules. I did not demand special treatment. And yet, my presence was seen as a disruption." Her fingers moved faster now. "I was questioned by another passenger who believed that belonging must come with proof, that the sight of a black woman in a premium seat was enough to trigger suspicion." She paused, looked out the window. The Pacific Ocean was slowly coming into view beneath the clouds. But what he didn't realize, what many still fail to understand, is that our presence is not a threat. Our existence is not a mistake to be explained. And our silence is not agreement. It is endurance. She saved the draft, turned off the screen, and closed her eye. From the row behind her, Elaine watched, and something shifted in her too. Not guilt, not yet, but discomfort. The kind that comes when you realize you have been complicit not only in silence, but in participation. Elaine looked at Greg, who was now sweating, scrolling, scrambling for a narrative that would make him the victim. She stared at him for a moment, then turned away. In her heart, something quiet whispered, "You didn't stop him. You helped him." In seat 3D, the mother from earlier opened her notes app and began typing her own reflection. She wasn't a CEO. She wasn't famous. But she was a mother raising 2 sons, and she wanted them to know that if they saw injustice, they had to name it. The descent began. The engines shifted tone. Passengers adjusted their trays and stretched their backs. But none of them were the same as when they boarded, especially not Nadine. This flight had started as routine. A meeting in San Francisco, a board review, an investment pitch. But now, it had become a microcosm of a much larger question. Who gets to belong and who gets to decide? As the aircraft descended through layers of sunlight and cloud, Nadine looked out the window one last time. She smiled, faintly, because no matter how the world tried to define her, she knew exactly who she was. She had never belonged more. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as Flight 203 entered its final descent into San Francisco. Outside the windows, the sky had deepened to a honeyed hue, streaked with soft lavender clouds that hung like brushstrokes across the fading afternoon. The golden hour was approaching. In seat 1A, Nadine Langford adjusted her posture. She could feel the subtle downward angle of the aircraft, the slow but inevitable return to ground. But for her, the descent was not only physical. Something within her had shifted during this flight. It was not rage that filled her, nor weariness. It was conviction, steady, rooted, behind her. Greg Talbot sat rigid in his seat, arms folded tightly across his chest. His phone buzzed again, then again. A notification from his corporate affairs team, another from a reporter at a major tech blog. He ignored them both. The pressure behind his temples throbbed. Elaine hadn't spoken in over 10 minutes. Not to him, not to anyone. She sat angled slightly away, arms crossed, gaze forward. In the silence between them, an invisible wall had formed. Something brittle had cracked in the way she saw her husband. The shame that had initially been directed at the internet was now quietly turning inward. She was complicit. The thought had no volume, but it pulsed. She had held up the phone. She had pressed record. She had smiled as her husband demanded proof from a stranger whose only threat had been dignity, now that dignity had held its ground. And her own reflection, suddenly, did not look so clean. A few rows back, Caitlin Everett clutched the book in her lap. She was still too stunned to speak, still processing. She had seen stories like this unfold in classrooms, on TikTok, in the essays of people she admired. But this time, she had witnessed it herself. Not on a screen, not retold, but raw, in real time. And the woman at the center of it wasn't just a case study. She was a teacher in her own right, a model of restraint, of grace wrapped in steel. "Next to Caitlin," the woman from 4B whispered. "You okay?" Caitlin nodded slowly. "I think I just watched history bend a little." The older woman smiled sadly. "It only bends when someone refuses to move." Meanwhile, Olivia, the flight attendant, was quietly gathering the final trash bags near the cockpit. She had avoided making eye contact with Greg since the captain's announcement. Her hands moved with a kind of ritual rhythm, but her mind wandered. She had seen passengers escorted off flights for less. She had seen mothers of color mistaken for nannies, veterans mistaken for threats, students mistaken for stowaways. And today, she had seen a woman elegant, poised, accomplished, questioned, not for what she had done, but for the simple audacity of sitting in a seat she paid for. Olivia pressed her back against the galley wall and breathed deep. Her name tag felt heavier than usual. It wasn't guilt she felt. It was responsibility. In the cockpit, Captain Luis Navarro checked his instruments. The plane was descending smoothly, But his thoughts drifted again to the passenger in 1A. He had seen enough news cycles to know how fast these things could spiral, and he'd also seen how many of them fizzled out, drowned in denial and PR spin. But this one felt different, because Nadine Langford didn't chase drama. She chose impact, and if she chose to speak, the industry would have to listen. He keyed his mic again. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for arrival. In first class. Nadine placed her tablet back in its sleeve. She didn't need to reread her statement. She had written it with her entire chest. Her fingers had not trembled once. She knew what she stood for. And now, she was ready for whatever came next. Across the aisle. The young man in 1C leaned over again. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "when you land, if there's anything I can do, statement, footage, witness testimony, I'm here." Nadine gave him a warm nod. "What's your name, Marcus?" "Thank you, Marcus." He smiled, then added, "I teach high school civics. Guess I have a new lesson plan." The wheels began to lower beneath them. The aircraft hummed with the familiar cadence of re-entry. The city of San Francisco stretched out beneath them like a map, glittering in the late daylight. As they dipped beneath the cloud line, Nadine could feel her heart shift from defense to intention. She had already prepared her public response, but now came the private work, the follow-through, the board meeting, the contracts, the policies, the questions that needed answers. Why did this still happen? Why were black women still assumed to be out of place? And most urgently, what would she do about it? In seat 3D, the mother who had silently observed most of the flight opened her notes app again and began typing a short message to her sons. "Boys, if you ever see someone being treated unfairly, do not wait for someone else to speak. Let your voice be first. Let your silence be last." She paused, added a heart emoji, then hit send in 2A. Greg wiped his forehead with a napkin. The seat felt too small now, the air too thick. He was already preparing his apology, though he hadn't decided if it would be public or if it would just be a call to his attorney. Elaine finally broke the silence between them. "You know she's going to respond," she said quietly. Greg didn't look at her. "She already has." The final announcement came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are on final approach into San Francisco International. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are secured." Nadine took one final look out the window. The bay waters sparkled below. She remembered coming here as a child, walking the marina with her father. He had taught her how to hold her head up even when the world tried to bow it down. "Your name means something," he used to say. "Don't let anybody shrink it." The landing gear touched down with a gentle jolt. The cabin bounced slightly, then steadied. They had arrived, and while the wheels slowed against the tarmac, the moment sped up, because on this flight, something had been named. Something old, something ugly, but also something strong, and it would not be tucked away once the doors opened. Not this time. The seatbelt sign chimed off with a soft ding. Nadine remained seated as passengers began to rise, unbuckling, stretching, retrieving bags from the overhead compartments. She had learned long ago that being first off the plane did not matter. What mattered was who you were when you walked off. She watched silently as the ripple of movement flowed around her. Greg Talbot stood abruptly, his face flushed. His wife, Elaine, avoided looking at him. She tucked her purse under her arm. Her lips pursed into a straight line of polite exhaustion. The line of denial had begun to fray inside her. A few rows back, Caitlin Everett stayed seated, quietly observing. She noticed who thanked the flight attendants and who did not, who walked past Nadine without a glance and who paused. She was already shaping a new essay in her head. It would begin not with outrage, but with a question. What does it cost to be seen as belonging Marcus? The civics teacher from 1C stood and gently reached for his bag. Before turning, he paused beside Nadine. "Thank you again, Dr. Langford," he said quietly. "You didn't just carry yourself with grace. You gave the rest of us something to carry too." Nadine looked up at him, her expression softening. "I hope you teach your students what you showed me today," she said. "I will," he nodded. The cabin door opened with a sudden hiss. A blast of dry airport air poured in, washing over the front cabin. San Francisco International buzzed with its usual rhythm just outside the threshold. Gate agents chatted behind the jet bridge windows. Luggage carts rumbled on the tarmac below. But inside the aircraft, time still felt suspended. Greg made his way down the aisle first, his pace tight and brisk. He looked neither left nor right. His mind ran on overdrive, calculating the reach of the fallout, the emails he'd need to send, the version of the story he'd spin. He was already rewriting himself as the misunderstood one. Elaine followed, slower, her feet heavy, her face unreadable. Before exiting, she turned just enough to glance back toward seat 1A. For a flicker of a second, her eyes met Nadine's. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But something passed between them. Not apology, not forgiveness, recognition. And then she was gone. Nadine finally stood. She moved with calm precision, reaching for her small black carry-on, her leather folio tucked under her arm. Olivia stood near the galley, eyes meeting hers with quiet solidarity. "Thank you for how you handled everything," Olivia said, her voice low. "You did what you could," Nadine replied. "But doing better next time, that's where the change begins." Olivia nodded. Understood. Nadine stepped into the jet bridge. The air outside felt different. Cooler. Sharper. Not because of the temperature, but because of what she carried now. Her dignity was intact, but her patience had worn thinner. There had been too many incidents like this. Too many stories that follow the same trajectory: suspicion, escalation, explanation, and then silence. Not this time. A young woman from Solstice's gate crew approached her with wide eyes. "Dr. Langford," she said nervously. "The airport director is on his way. He asked if you would like a private escort to the terminal lounge or ground transport." Nadine offered a brief, gracious smile. "No need. I'd like to walk through the concourse, just like everyone else." The woman nodded, flustered. "Of course. I'm so sorry for what happened on board." "Then make sure it doesn't happen again," Nadine said gently. The woman opened her mouth, then nodded again and stepped back. As Nadine walked down the jet bridge and into the terminal, passengers parted. Some recognized her. Some only sensed her presence. But nearly everyone watched. Not because she was dramatic, not because she demanded attention, but because she moved with a gravity that could not be ignored. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jared. Statement prepped. Scheduled for release at 5:02 p.m. Pacific, across all channels. Solstice Legal copied. Board invited to review ahead of PR response. Another message? From Chairwoman Loris Benton. "I saw the video. I saw the grace. You have full backing. Let's make this more than a headline." And one final message. From Zuri. "Saw the video. Everyone at school talking about it. But I'm okay. You're everything I want to be when I grow up." Nadine paused mid-stride, eyes stinging as she held her phone close to her chest for a moment. The world could say what it wanted, twist the narrative, debate intention. But this right here was the reason she carried herself with restraint. Her daughter was watching. She walked on, the sounds of the terminal rising around her. Announcements crackled overhead. Suitcases wheeled by. Families reunited. Pilots passed with respectful nods. Then, just ahead, a small group began to form near a glass wall overlooking the runway. Cameras lifted. A few reporters who had caught wind of her arrival were already assembling. Jared had warned her about the possibility. "Keep it tight," he had said. "Say what you mean. Nothing more." Nadine straightened her posture and walked directly toward them. A young black woman holding a mic called out first. "Dr. Langford, is it true you were racially profiled on Flight 203 today?" Nadine stopped. Not in defiance, but in calm readiness. "I was challenged in my seat by another passenger who assumed I did not belong," she said clearly. "And while I am not the first black woman this has happened to, I intend to help ensure I am among the last." The murmurs began immediately. Another reporter asked, "Will Solstice Airlines face consequences?" Nadine replied, "We will be holding internal reviews, not just for crew behavior, but also for how we prepare passengers to coexist with dignity. Policy without culture is hollow." "Do you plan to sue?" someone asked. She shook her head gently. "I'm not interested in court battles. I'm interested in culture shifts, real accountability, sustainable equity." Then she turned to leave, but added one final sentence before walking on. "And let it be known, black success does not require explanation, nor permission." The reporters stood still for a beat, as if the air had thickened. And then the flurry resumed. Phones raised, texts firing off. But Nadine didn't wait for the news cycle. She walked calmly toward the terminal's glass doors. Her car was waiting. Her resolve was clearer than ever. Nadine Langford sat in the back seat of the black sedan as it pulled away from the curb at San Francisco International. The city skyline loomed in the distance, bathed in the soft orange of late afternoon. She did not speak. Her phone buzzed every few seconds with new messages, interviews, board members, think tanks, letters of support, think pieces already being written. But Nadine's eyes stayed fixed on the window. The reflections of the passing world moved across the glass like waves. For all the noise happening outside, her thoughts turned inward. There was a strange stillness that came after a storm. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of decision. She had not asked for a fight. She had boarded that plane the way she had boarded hundreds of flights before. With dignity, with simplicity, with focus. But what had happened on Flight 203 refused to stay confined to the cabin. It had leaked into the national conversation, and Nadine knew exactly why. Because deep down, this wasn't about her. It was about every black woman who had ever sat in a seat and been asked to explain it. Every professional who had been mistaken for the help. Every dignified soul who had swallowed the urge to shout, choosing instead to hold themselves higher. The car pulled up in front of a modest building tucked just a few blocks from the financial district. It wasn't the company's headquarters. It was their foundation hub, the heartbeat of the Langford Initiative. Jared was already waiting outside with his laptop under one arm and a calm urgency in his eyes. "You okay?" he asked as she stepped out. Nadine nodded once. "I'm clear." He held the door for her and followed her inside. The space was quiet, cool, and filled with natural light. On the far wall hung a mural featuring portraits of women in STEM from around the world. Underneath it read a single quote, "Place is not given. It is claimed." She paused for just a moment in front of the mural, then walked to the main conference room. The team had gathered. Communications, legal, outreach, strategic relations, all standing, all waiting. Jared cleared his throat. Dr. Langford, everyone's here. Media is requesting a formal video response. The chairwoman has pre-approved messaging. We also have incoming requests from several university networks. They want to know if you'll speak on racial bias in leadership seats. Nadine looked around the room. These were not just colleagues. These were believers, people who had built this mission beside her. And if she was going to answer, she needed to answer for all of them. She stepped forward. "Let's begin with this," she said. "We are not going to make this about me. We are going to make this about structure, about how ordinary behavior reveals extraordinary bias, about how we normalize suspicion based on skin, gender, and presence." The room nodded. "We won't be angry for show, but we will be firm in our truth. Let the language reflect dignity, not defensiveness. Let it be an invitation for reform, not a permission slip for pity." One of the communications leads asked gently, "Do you want to name the passenger?" Nadine shook her head. "This is not about him. This is about what allowed his assumption to feel ordinary. He is not the root. He is the fruit of something deeper." The room fell into thoughtful silence. Then Jared spoke. "We've got a 4:45 studio slot. If we move fast, we can get you mic'd and ready. The statement's already loaded into prompter format." Nadine nodded. "Let's go. Within minutes." She was seated in a small media room, lights glowing softly overhead. A mic was clipped to her lapel. Her reflection stared back from the blackened monitor just beyond the camera lens. She didn't blink, didn't shift. And when the red light went on, she began. "My name is Dr. Nadine Langford. I am the founder and CEO of the Langford Initiative and a board member of Solstice Airlines. Today, I took Flight 203 from New York to San Francisco, expecting a routine journey. What I encountered was not uncommon, but it was unacceptable." She paused. "I was approached by a fellow passenger and asked to prove that I belonged in my seat. I was not loud. I was not disruptive. I was not mistaken. I was simply visible." Her voice remained steady, measured, strong. "What happened to me today is not rare, and that is the problem. When we treat seats as symbols of worthiness, and worthiness as a reflection of race, we create an atmosphere where suspicion becomes instinct and equality becomes performance. To the airline, to the public, to every institution watching. Oh, I say this, policies mean nothing without culture. Culture means nothing without accountability. And accountability begins the moment we name the harm and refuse to normalize it." She drew in a breath. "This will not be an isolated headline. It will be the start of a new internal campaign at Solstice Airlines called Seat Safety, Equity, Access, and Trust. Because no one should have to defend their right to simply exist with dignity." The light clicked off. The room sat in stillness. Jared stepped forward, nodding with pride and purpose. It was perfect. "No," Nadine said softly. "It was necessary." She stood, unhooked her mic, and walked toward the windows. From the 12th floor, the city looked small, but her role in shaping it suddenly felt larger than ever. She remembered her father's voice again, the same words he spoke after her first TED Talk. Speak like someone who has nothing to prove but everything to offer. And today, that is what she had done. The phone buzzed again. A message from Zuri. "You looked beautiful and powerful, and you made it look easy." Nadine smiled, typed a quick reply. It wasn't easy, but it was right. The video was posted at exactly 5:02 p.m. Pacific Time. Within minutes, it took on a pulse of its own. At first, it was just retweets, quiet shares, a few shocked replies. But by 5:14 p.m., the views had crossed 300,000. By 5:37 p.m., the clip had been embedded in national outlets. By 6:10 p.m., it became the lead headline on a dozen major sites. Black CEO confronted mid-flight. Her graceful response is what everyone's talking about. She had receipts. She had dignity. She had 1A. The footage wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no physical altercation, just a conversation, recorded from behind, showing a man asking Nadine Langford to prove her identity. His voice was firm, entitled, her voice calm and unyielding. And then it cut to her exit from the plane, a woman in full control. Not a meltdown, a masterclass. People did not scroll past it. They watched it all the way through. Comment sections exploded with thousands of voices. I've had this happen to my mom. I still think about how she smiled and said nothing. She was fire-wrapped in silk. People like Greg Talbot never expect consequences. That's why they act like security guards for spaces they don't own. This is how you lead a nation without yelling once. By 7:00 p.m., a trending hashtag emerged. Belong in May. Caitlin Everett watched it unfold from her small dorm room at UC Berkeley. Her phone screen glowed, swiping from post to post, her heart racing. She had told her friends she was there. She had even written a short reflection piece and submitted it to a student publication. But now, sitting at her desk in silence, Caitlin realized something else. She wasn't just a witness to a moment. She was watching a shift, the kind that lodges itself into national memory. A woman had drawn a line in the sand, not with rage, but with rooted presence, and everyone felt it. Meanwhile, in a sleek conference room on the 17th floor of Solstice Airlines headquarters, board members sat frozen around a glowing screen. The footage had just finished playing for the 5th time. No one dared speak first. Chairwoman Loris Benton leaned forward. "Well," she said, "that's not how we want to trend." A murmur of agreement moved through the room. One of the legal advisors spoke. "We've already received 5 media requests, 2 inquiries from labor groups, and a demand letter from the Equal Equity Coalition." Another executive rubbed his forehead. "Is the crew being investigated?" "The flight crew acted professionally," Loris replied. "But the incident didn't start with the staff. It started with a passenger who felt empowered to police another passenger's worthiness. Still," someone muttered, "this could damage our image." Loris turned sharply to face him. "Our image is already damaged if the public thinks our cabins are places where entitlement gets a louder voice than dignity." The room went quiet again. Another advisor shifted in her chair. "Dr. Langford's seat initiative is brilliant. And if we're smart, we'll meet her proposal with action, not panic." Loris nodded. "Schedule an emergency summit with our DEI leadership and make sure her voice is at the center of it." Then she looked out the window, toward the glowing skyline. She didn't just speak truth, she modeled it. Let's not waste that moment. At the same time, in a suburban home outside Dallas, a young boy named Caleb sat on the couch beside his grandmother. He was only 10, but the video of Nadine Langford had stopped him mid-snack. "Why did they think she didn't belong there?" he asked. His grandmother looked at the screen, then at him. "Because sometimes people forget that money and title don't protect you from how this world sees your skin." Caleb frowned, but she didn't even get mad. "No, baby," she said. She didn't need to. She let the world watch the wrong person embarrass himself. He nodded slowly. "Do you think I could be like her?" She smiled, smoothed his curls. "You already are, in the center of the storm." Nadine stood once again in her foundation's hallway. The staff had gone home. Jared had left to attend an interview on her behalf. The lights were dimmed, and all that remained was the quiet hum of the city outside. She walked to her office and sat down in the chair she had owned for over a decade. The wood arms were smooth from wear, the cushions worn, molded to her posture. She opened the drawer and pulled out a small photo. Her father, standing in front of his old barber shop in Atlanta, hands behind his back, chin raised, pride without arrogance. She thought about how he had carved out dignity with clippers and calm in a world that rarely offered softness to black men. She whispered to the photo, "I'm still learning from you." Her phone buzzed. A call? Unknown number? She hesitated, then answered. A woman's voice came through. "Dr. Langford, my name is Isabel Mendez. I'm the daughter of Rosa Mendez. She was on your flight. She's elderly. She's never used social media in her life. But when she saw what happened to you, she asked me to call you." Nadine blinked, then smiled. "Go ahead. She just wanted to tell you. She's proud of you, and that she prayed for you the moment she saw you walk by. She said she could feel something in you, that you were walking with ancestors." Nadine closed her eyes, her hand on her chest. "Tell her thank you, from the deepest part of me." "I will," Isabel said softly. She also wanted to know if there was any way she could donate to your foundation. Nadine laughed gently. "Yes. And we'll send her a handwritten letter in return." After they hung up, she stayed still for a long time. She thought about the child on the couch, the grandmother beside him, the teacher ready to change his lesson, the airline preparing to reform, the woman in 2A who might think twice before defending cruelty again, and the thousands of strangers who, for one moment, saw her not as exceptional, but as entirely human, not an icon, a mirror, a challenge, and an invitation. This, she knew, was only the beginning. 3 days after the incident on Flight 203, the boardroom at Solstice Airlines was full. The glass table gleamed under the morning sun. Executives, attorneys, equity officers, media consultants, and shareholder representatives lined the walls and filled the chairs. Yet there was no tension in the air, only clarity, the kind that arrives when pretending is no longer an option. At the head of the table sat Dr. Nadine Langford. She wore a charcoal blazer, a white blouse with clean lines, and a single silver ring her father's on her left hand. She didn't come to make a spectacle. She came to lead. To her right sat Chairwoman Loris Benton. She gave Nadine a steady look as the meeting was called to order. "Let's begin," Loris said. "We are not here to manage a crisis. We are here to realign a culture." Nadine stood slowly. All eyes turned toward her. No screens, no assistants, no notes. "I want to thank you for being present," she began. "Not just physically, but emotionally, intellectually, personally." She paused. "What happened to me on that flight happens to black women and people of color every day in offices, on streets, in classrooms, in hospitals, and in cabins 35,000 feet in the air. But when it happens to someone with access and title, it's suddenly newsworthy. That tells us something. It tells us that society still values voices not by their truth, but by their position." She walked slowly along one side of the table. But what if we listened before the trending moment? What if we didn't need a viral video to validate harm? What if we change the culture that makes that harm so common in the first place? She let the question linger. Then she continued, I'm not here to take a victory lap. I'm here to make sure this is not forgotten after the headlines fade. And that's why today I'm formally launching the SEAT initiative across all Solstice operations safety, equity, access, and trust. A slide appeared on the digital wall behind her with the 4 words, Safety meant psychological security, not just for customers, but for crew, for every person who walks onto an aircraft and deserves to feel human, not judged. Equity meant meaningful training, not a slideshow in a break room, but immersive, community-informed education on implicit bias and structural injustice. Access meant auditing boarding, seating, and complaint procedures, ensuring they serve all passengers equally, not just the loudest or wealthiest. And trust meant accountability, creating measurable standards for passenger interactions, feedback loops that don't bury discrimination complaints, and building a culture where employees and passengers alike are empowered to intervene when something goes wrong. Nadine faced them again. I will personally chair the SEAT oversight panel, and every board member here today will be required to undergo the same cultural equity training as our flight crews. Because leadership isn't about being above the system. It's about modeling what accountability looks like inside it. There were no murmurs, no discomfort, just quiet focus. And then a hand rose from the far end of the table. It was Michael Peng, head of international partnerships. I have a question, he said. Not about the initiative, but about you. Nadine inclined her head. You didn't yell. You didn't escalate. You didn't even use the words discrimination or racism in that moment. Why? She paused thoughtfully. Because I didn't need to, she answered. The truth didn't require noise. It required presence. And if I'd raised my voice, the story might have shifted. Suddenly, I'd be the difficult one, the threatening one, the one who overreacted. She paused again. That's what restraint looks like when the world expects you to perform your pain. I didn't give them that performance. I gave them myself. The room sat still, humbled. After the meeting, as people rose to leave, several approached her privately. Some offered reflections, some offered apologies. A few simply asked what they could read or watch to better understand. And one woman, a flight operations director named Aria Lin, asked if Nadine would speak to new hires at their next orientation, not as a board member, not as a headline, but as a traveler, a mother, a woman who simply wanted to fly without being questioned. Nadine said yes. Outside the building, camera crews were already forming. She knew the press would be waiting. But this time, the story was different. This time, there was policy behind the principle. This time, there were signatures behind the soundbite. She stepped to the podium set up just beyond the building's entrance. Jared stood nearby, ready to cue the prepared statement if needed. But Nadine didn't reach for it. Instead, she looked directly into the cameras and said, "To every person who has ever been told they were too loud, too angry, too bold, too black, too much, please know, you do not have to shrink to fit into unjust spaces. You can sit in your seat with your shoulders square and your story whole." She continued, "We've launched SEAT not just for passengers, but for everyone who moves through the world with history on their skin. For everyone who's ever had to smile through suspicion. For everyone who's ever been asked to prove their worth." Her voice remained steady. "You don't have to earn belonging. It is your birthright." The reporters began shouting questions, but Nadine turned, nodded once to Jared, and walked away. Her car was waiting, inside, The leather seats were cool against her back. She pulled out her phone and opened her messages. There was one from Zuri, sent just a minute ago. "Mom, they showed your speech at school." Even the teachers got quiet. "My friend said you're her new favorite superhero." Nadine smiled and typed back. "Superheroes get tired too, but I'm still flying." As the car moved through the city streets, Nadine leaned her head back and looked out the window. She saw a father holding a little girl's hand, a teacher walking briskly with her coffee, a boy on a bus staring out the window, a flight crew stepping out of a hotel lobby in uniform. She saw the world still moving, still needing truth, still needing change, and she knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. A new altitude, a new kind of flight, and this time, no one would question whether she belonged on board. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't throw accusations. She didn't beg for respect. Instead, Dr. Nadine Langford stood in her truth, and in doing so, she made millions reflect on theirs. In a world where seats often symbolize status, and skin color is still policed by assumptions, her calm became a revolution. Her restraint became her roar. Her presence on Flight 203 wasn't just a routine journey. It was a challenge to a system that too often questions who belongs where. This story isn't just about one flight. It's about every woman who has been overlooked, every black professional who's had to prove themselves twice just to be seen once, and every silent injustice that begs to be named. But it's also a story of hope, of change, of what happens when one person dares to lead by example. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, ache, or rise a little taller, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because the next story might be yours. And trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next.